to talk a little bit about Saudi Arabia, which has been the major intervening force in the war in Yemen, can you talk a little bit about the US-Saudi relationship, and specifically during the Trump administration, we saw Congress stand up to the president in a bipartisan way on several occasions when it came to war powers and arms sales, to oppose the war in Yemen. And you even saw a candidate, Joe Biden, on the debate stage call Saudi Arabia a pariah state, and saying that if he was made president, that he would stop support for the Saudi war in Yemen. What has changed between then and now? And what do you see as the major differences or lack of difference between Trump policy and Biden policy on Yemen?
Yeah, so it is fairly frustrating the extent to which there had been a lot of optimism that Biden had come out very strongly on the campaign trail. And then subsequently, one of his first foreign policy speeches on February 4th, he declared quite definitively that the US was going to end support for offensive military actions in Yemen, including relevant arms sales. However, there have been subsequent efforts by Congress to ask the Biden administration to define what exactly that means, what are considered relevant arms sales. It's a notorious issue within international relations to kind of define offensive versus defensive weapons. You know, a weapon that was used for defense can be just as easily, or many weapons can often be then pointed at the enemy and used offensively. And so I think a clear reason, or one of the reasons that we saw a shift in Congress, was that there was a lot of frustration about the Trump administration's very close partnership with Saudi Arabia. And we especially saw this after the brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi in 2018. And up to that point, we'd seen this narrative in the United States that hailed Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, as this exciting reformer who is going to let women drive and return Saudi Arabia to moderate Islam. This is my area of focus for my dissertation, was sort of looking at those kinds of narratives and the way that Arab governments have tended to portray themselves as reformers and as sort of embodying so-called moderate Islam, when in fact that often just means being obedient to the ruler and demonizing Islamist political opposition groups. But so we saw a big shift after Khashoggi, and it was actually after that time, even prior to the midterms when the Democrats retook control of the House, that you saw the US end mid-air refueling for Saudi jets, which did reduce the number of bombs they could drop on a single sortie, but didn't really constrain the Saudis' to continue to bomb Yemen, because the Yemen and Saudi Arabia border each other and they're able to just fly right over. And so unfortunately, I think one major difference was this perception that Trump was too close to the Saudis and too willing to sort of give up any kind of American values in exchange for weapon sales to the Saudis. However, we also saw huge numbers of weapon sales under Obama, and we're continuing to see weapon sales move through under Biden. So unfortunately, I think just candidate Biden talked a big game, and now that he's in power, we're not seeing him really stick to the commitments he had made about ending US support for offensive military action. One thing he could do would be to cancel the US contracts. The Saudi, 75% of Saudi's Air Force approximately is US made, and the other 25% or so is UK made. And so if Biden came out very strongly and said, I'm canceling any sort of maintenance or spare parts contracts until Saudi Arabia, you withdraw from Yemen, those planes would be almost immediately grounded. They need new tires every time they take off. And if Biden likewise said to Boris Johnson, look, we really are going to make ending Saudi aggression on Yemen a priority, the UK has already slashed humanitarian funding to Yemen. We know that they're not really interested in they wouldn't go against the United States on this if Biden made sure that it was clear that this was a priority. So in general, it's the military-industrial complex. It's the fact that it's a lot easier to say things on the campaign trail than it is to follow through with them once you're in the White House.
Yes, but one thing that I think makes President Biden a bit vulnerable is how stridently he came out, both on the campaign trail and in that initial foreign policy address on February the 4th, I believe, at the State Department. Activists were, hesitant a little, were always skeptical, but many were absolutely thrilled with how clear he was in opposing the Saudi war and saying that we were going to end all support for offensive operations. Now, this is a good question. We're going to get to questions from the chat and audience a little bit later, but this is a good one to introduce now. This is from Marcus, who says, would Saudi Arabia be able to continue its involvement in Yemen without US support? So it's really the question. Like you said, these F-15s, I think, largely are the workhorse of the Saudi Air Force. How on earth can the administration plausibly say that it's not supporting offensive operations when it's allowing the maintenance of these planes that are then going out and bombing Yemen offensively?
Precisely. I mean, I think what I've heard from the staff of these various congressional offices is that the way that they're currently defining US involvement looked more like the mid-air refueling, where the US military was actively involved. Whereas some of these US military contractors are private companies that have been contracted by the Saudi government to conduct maintenance and provide spare parts for the Saudi Air Force. So if Biden were to move forward and cancel those, which he could do by executive order, that would be a new step. That wouldn't just be telling the US military, that would be really going toe-to-toe with the military-industrial complex and sort of striking at the bottom line of some of these military contractors, these private American companies that have signed contracts to carry out this work. And so it really does get to this question of the distinction between what the US military is doing and what sort of the broader military-industrial complex is doing. I'm not familiar with a case, and you would probably know much better than I in terms of other cases outside of Yemen, whether there have been other instances where a US president went in and declared that US military contractors were not going to be allowed to continue their work. So I think that is part of the distinction, or the distinction that at least I'm hearing from staffers on the Hill, who are just questioning whether something like a war powers resolution is in fact called for. I think the rejoinder to that would be essentially that what Saudi Arabia is doing is completely egregious, in particular continuing to carry out the blockade, which is by definition an offensive action. You can't have a defensive blockade. So to the extent that the United States is, for example, continuing to maintain UN Security Council Resolution 2216, we are perpetuating the conflict. To the extent the US is continuing to provide maintenance to Saudi planes, we are perpetuating the conflict and assisting in offensive action. And yet it's not quite at the level of really kinetic action on the ground by US service members. So I think, and just to get to your point, Brian, about the fact that Biden did come out so clearly and use the words, this war has to end, for example. which, as you said, really some people were really excited at the fact that Biden had made such a clear statement. So the Biden administration has opened themselves up to criticism on this point, and I think they're kind of just hoping that they don't get called out about it. And thus far, unfortunately, what we've seen from Congress is a certain level of hesitancy from people like Ro Khanna, for example, who had previously been involved in the War Powers Resolution that Trump ultimately vetoed. Bernie Sanders had been involved and at the present just isn't seeming to want to push on this issue. Obviously, we're all aware of the vast domestic issues the United States is facing right now, and members of Congress are caught up with that. But in general, I think a War Powers Resolution is really required in order to draw attention, first of all, to draw attention to the egregiousness of what's happening in Yemen, and the fact the United States continues to aid and abet it. And that other legislative avenues, for example, with the National Defense Authorization Act, and there has been language proposed for the NDAA to end any kind of support, U.S. military support or maintenance or spare parts or any funds going to what the Saudis are doing in Yemen. But the concern on that is during the process of reconciliation, the amendments, those kinds of amendments tend to drop out. We've observed that in the past on other issues, whereas a War Powers Resolution would necessitate a floor vote and would, if nothing else, even if the conclusion reached was that the United States is not necessarily, that the involvement of the United States doesn't quite reach a threshold. In general, it would be an opportunity for all members of Congress to have to weigh in on the subject, to draw attention to what's happening in Yemen, and I mean, essentially, it's up to us as the American people to push our representatives to show that we understand that one of the only ways to push the Biden administration on this is through Congress, and if we, their constituents, insist that they continue to draw attention to this and to make a big deal about it, they're going to have to listen to us.